If you've ever felt dismissed before someone even took the time to know your heart, stay with me until the very end, because this story is for everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly broken in public and forced to smile through it. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because every story we share here is a reminder that one painful moment can become the doorway to an entirely different life. On the night he was rejected, Ethan Cole looked exactly like the kind of man most people assumed had everything. At 38, he was the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing accessibility tech companies in the country. Business magazines called him visionary. Investors called him relentless. Employees called him fair. His competitors called him dangerous. His mother still called him by the same nickname she'd used when he was 6 years old and stubbornly trying to fix a broken toaster with a plastic spoon, "My impossible boy." He was tall, calm, and carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years learning not to waste energy explaining himself. His suits were tailored. His watches were simple and expensive. His apartment overlooked the river. His schedule was packed weeks in advance. But none of those things had ever protected him from the one kind of silence that still hurt. Ethan was deaf. Not partially. Not hard of hearing. Fully deaf. He had lost his hearing after a severe bout of meningitis at the age of 7. One winter, the world had been full of ordinary noise, his mother humming in the kitchen, his father laughing too loudly at old sitcoms, the bark of the neighbor's dog every morning at 6, and then, after the fever broke, everything had disappeared. No gradual fading. No warning. Just stillness. He remembered, even now, the terrified way his mother's mouth had trembled when she said his name and he hadn't turned. He remembered doctors speaking with careful faces. He remembered adults using words around him as if he could no longer understand anything because he could no longer hear. He remembered anger, then shame for feeling it, then something that would define the rest of his life, determination. His father, a mechanic with rough hands and an unshakable sense of loyalty, learned sign language before Ethan had even been discharged from the hospital. His mother learned twice as fast. They labeled everything in the house. Spoon. Door. Window. Dream. Apology. Again. Enough. Love. They told him the world would try to decide what his silence meant, and that his job was not to beg it for approval. His job was to build a life so large that no one's assumptions could contain it. And Ethan had done exactly that. He graduated top of his class. He built software that made workplace communication easier for deaf and hard-of-hearing professionals. He sat through humiliating meetings in his 20s where older executives spoke to his interpreter instead of to him, then smiled and bought their companies 10 years later. He became the man newspapers admired because he had turned personal struggle into innovation. But the newspapers never wrote about how lonely success could be when every room you entered had already decided whether you were inspiring, inconvenient, or broken. Dating had always been the worst of it. Not because Ethan lacked confidence. He had confidence in abundance. But romance asked for a different kind of vulnerability. Investors could reject his numbers, that stung his pride. A woman could reject his humanity in 60 seconds, that touched an older wound. He had been ghosted after first dates because using text-to-speech apps in noisy restaurants made women uncomfortable. He had once spent 3 weeks talking to someone who seemed deeply interested until she finally asked, in a message too cheerful to be kind, whether deafness was hereditary because she wanted healthy kids someday. Another woman told him he was too inspirational, and that being with him made her feel shallow. She meant it as a compliment. He went home and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. So by the time his younger sister Claire insisted he try one more blind date, Ethan had already made peace with staying alone. Claire, however, had never accepted any version of Ethan's life that felt smaller than it should be. "She's smart," Claire had texted. "She's beautiful, yes, but that's not the point. She works in publishing. Loves books. Volunteers on weekends. And before you ask, yes, she knows you're deaf. Ethan had stared at the screen, unconvinced. Then Claire had sent another message. Just dinner. If it's awful, I'll owe you for a month. Ethan had smiled despite himself. That was how, on a Thursday evening in early autumn, he found himself sitting alone at a candlelit table in a restaurant too elegant for first meetings and too dim for easy lip reading. The place was one of those upscale spots where the lighting seemed designed by people who believed mystery was more romantic than visibility. Warm amber lamps hung over polished wood tables. Glasses glimmered. Servers moved like choreography. Across the room, couples leaned in toward each other, close enough that Ethan could not hear their laughter but could see it. He checked his phone. 7:04 p.m. The reservation had been for 7. He adjusted the angle of the small table lamp toward his side of the table, subtle enough not to attract attention. He preferred good lighting, it made reading lips easier. He took a sip of water and watched the entrance. At 7:11, she arrived. Her name was Vanessa. She was beautiful in the polished, practiced way of women who knew that every detail had been considered and every detail was working. Dark hair in smooth waves. Perfect makeup. A cream-colored dress. Confidence radiating from her posture like perfume. She spotted Ethan immediately, smiled, and walked over. Ethan stood to greet her and offered his hand. She took it, then sat. Her smile remained, but only at the corners, as if she were performing warmth rather than feeling it. "Hi," she said. Ethan pointed gently to his phone and then signed with one hand while speaking carefully, his voice shaped from memory more than sound. "Hi. I'm Ethan. Nice to meet you. I'm deaf, so if you face me while speaking, it helps." He was used to saying it early. Better to place reality on the table before awkwardness built around it. For 1 second, Vanessa froze. It was so brief another person might have missed it. But Ethan had spent a lifetime noticing micro-expressions. Her shoulders stiffened. Her smile slipped. Her eyes flicked, not to his face, but to the hearing aids that sat behind his ears, though they gave him little functional benefit. Then she leaned back. "Oh," she said. 1 word. 2 letters. But somehow it sounded like a door shutting. Ethan kept his face open, patient. "I didn't realize," she said. He blinked once. Claire had told him otherwise. He typed quickly on his phone and turned the screen toward her. "My sister said you knew." Vanessa looked almost annoyed now, as if the evening had become administratively inconvenient. "She mentioned some kind of hearing issue, but I thought she meant minor." "Like?" "I don't know. I didn't know you were actually deaf." Actually deaf. There it was. The familiar line between acceptable difference and unacceptable reality. Ethan held her gaze. He wanted to believe adults grew kinder with age. He wanted to believe people in expensive restaurants had better manners than teenagers in high school cafeterias. But pain doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives dressed well, with manicured nails and a sympathetic expression. Vanessa picked up the menu, then put it down without opening it. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't look sorry. "I just don't think this is what I signed up for." He felt heat rise in his chest. Around them, conversations flowed. A waiter approached, then hesitated, sensing something off. Vanessa continued, perhaps because she mistook Ethan's silence for permission. "I mean, I'm sure you're a great person. Obviously. And what you've accomplished is amazing. Really amazing. But I just think relationships should be easy. And this seems like a lot. A lot." Ethan looked at her carefully, as if committing the moment to a file he would later label and store somewhere far from the center of himself. He had no desire to perform dignity for someone who had not earned it. Still, dignity was the only answer he trusted. He typed again. "Thank you for being honest." That should have been the end. But Vanessa, perhaps uncomfortable with being the villain in her own story, gave a little laugh and said one more thing. "It's probably better to know now than later, right?" Then she stood. She stood before the appetizers. Before the water had even warmed. Before she knew the first thing about him beyond the condition of his ears. She took her purse, gave him a small embarrassed nod, and walked away. No scene. No shouting. No spilled wine. Just absence. Ethan remained standing for a moment after she left, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, the restaurant blurring at the edges. He could feel people looking. Not many. Just enough. A couple at the next table quickly glanced away. A server shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere in the room, a candle flickered in a draft from the open entrance. He sat down slowly. On nights like that, the world felt louder in its own silent way. Rejection carried body language, timing, texture. He didn't need sound to hear humiliation. His first instinct was to leave. His second was to text Claire and tell her never, ever to fix him up again. His third, small, tired, and older than pride, was simply to sit still for a minute and let the hurt pass through instead of pretending it hadn't happened. So he stayed. He loosened his tie. He stared at the untouched menu. He thought about being 7 years old and realizing that people often confused disability with deficiency. He thought about being 16 and watching a girl in chemistry class say with pitying eyes that dating him would be too hard. He thought about all the rooms he had conquered, all the stages he had stood on, all the contracts he had closed, and how none of it mattered when one stranger could still reduce him to inconvenience in under 3 minutes. Then, as he stared down at the folded napkin beside his plate, movement entered the edge of his vision. 2 little girls stood a few feet away from the table. They looked to be about 6, maybe 7. Identical, except one wore a yellow ribbon in her dark braid and the other a blue cardigan over her flowered dress. They had the unmistakable wide-eyed seriousness children carry when they are about to do something they know adults might disapprove of. One held a crayon and a children's menu. The other clutched a small plush rabbit by one ear. Ethan looked up, puzzled. The girl with the yellow ribbon lifted both hands and, in careful but unmistakable sign language, asked, "Can we join you?" For a second Ethan forgot to breathe. Her signing was not perfect. Her hand shapes were a little clumsy, her movement slower than fluent adult signers. But it was real. Clear. Intentional. Beside her, the other twin repeated the signs with fierce concentration, as if reinforcing the message. "Can we join you?" Ethan stared at them, then around the room, half expecting this to be some surreal exhaustion-induced hallucination. At a nearby table, a woman who looked to be in her early 30s was rising halfway from her seat, her face flushed with mortification. She signed hurriedly toward the girls, obviously calling them back. The girls ignored her. Ethan looked at them again. The one in yellow pointed at the empty chair where Vanessa had sat, then made the sign for left, followed by a heartbreaking approximation of sad. The other girl hugged her rabbit and nodded. Something inside Ethan, stretched tight and raw moments earlier, loosened so suddenly it almost hurt. He signed back, slowly, "You know sign language?" The girls lit up. The one in blue grinned and signed, a little. The one in yellow added, "Mom teaches us." Their mother was already at the table now, apologizing with both her face and her hands. Ethan could see the panic in her expression before she even reached him. She spoke, then immediately caught herself and began signing too, her movements quick, elegant, and far more fluent than the girls. "I am so sorry," she signed. They saw what happened. They shouldn't interrupt strangers. "Girls, come back now." The twins looked guilty but unconvinced. Ethan glanced from the mother to the children. The mother had tired eyes, the kind produced not by one bad night but by many long years of carrying too much. She was beautiful, though not in Vanessa's curated way. Her beauty was in movement, in warmth, in the strands of hair that had escaped her loose ponytail, in the protective way she placed one hand lightly near each daughter even while embarrassed. She wore a simple green sweater and no jewelry except a slim silver ring on a chain around her neck. Ethan surprised himself by signing, "It's okay." The woman hesitated. Then Ethan looked at the twins and added, "You may join me for 5 minutes if your mother says yes." The girls gasped as if granted access to a royal banquet. Their mother exhaled, half laugh and half defeat. 5 minutes, she signed firmly to them. Within seconds the twins had scrambled into the 2 empty chairs dragged awkwardly from a neighboring table. The one in yellow placed the plush rabbit carefully between herself and Ethan, as if the rabbit also needed a seat. The one in blue put the children's menu in front of him and pointed proudly to a maze she had nearly completed. Their mother remained standing, unsure whether to retreat or remain close enough to contain disaster. Ethan motioned to the 3rd empty chair at the edge of the table. "Please," he signed. "Sit too." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. "My name is Nora," she signed once seated. "These are Lily and Lucy." The one with the yellow ribbon pointed at herself. "Lily. Blue cardigan, Lucy." Ethan tapped his chest. "Ethan." Lily leaned forward immediately. "You are the sad man." Nora closed her eyes in horror. "Lily." But Ethan laughed. Not politely. Not carefully. He laughed with his whole face. "I was," he signed. Lucy held up her rabbit for his inspection. "Her name is Buttons. She helps with sad." "Well," Ethan signed gravely to the rabbit, "thank you, Buttons." Lucy beamed. Nora's embarrassment softened into something else then, relief, perhaps, or gratitude. For the first time, Ethan really looked at her. There was intelligence in her gaze. Watchfulness. The practiced alertness of someone always scanning for her children's needs before her own. Yet beneath that was gentleness, and beneath gentleness something like grief that had learned to live quietly. "We don't usually let them roam restaurants rescuing adults," Nora signed. "I'm honored to be the exception," Ethan replied. A server approached again, uncertain. Ethan waved him over and gestured that it was fine. The man relaxed when Nora interpreted. Menus were rearranged. A basket of bread appeared. Somehow, impossibly, a moment that had begun in humiliation shifted into one of the strangest and warmest dinners Ethan had ever had. He learned within 10 minutes that Lily and Lucy were not ordinary 6-year-olds, if there is such a thing. Lily, ribbon and all, was bold and socially fearless. She asked direct questions without malice and believed every problem was easier once named. Lucy was quieter, more observant, but when she did speak or sign it was often with startling insight. Together they had that twin rhythm children sometimes share, finishing each other's gestures and thoughts. He learned that Nora taught American Sign Language part-time at a community center and worked afternoons doing administrative support for a pediatric therapy clinic. He learned that the girls had been learning ASL since they were toddlers because Nora believed language should always expand compassion, not just utility. He learned this last part more slowly. When Ethan asked, "Why sign language?" Nora's expression changed. Not darker exactly, but more inward. She touched the silver ring hanging from the chain around her neck. "My husband was deaf," she signed. There was no dramatic pause, no invitation to pity, yet the meaning landed with weight. Ethan looked down once at the ring, then back to her face. "Was?" Nora nodded. "He died 3 years ago. Car accident." Lily and Lucy went quiet in the easy, matter-of-fact way children sometimes do around grief that has become part of family weather. Not new. Not gone. Just present. Ethan felt something tighten low in his chest. "I'm sorry," he signed. Nora's smile was small but real. "Thank you." Lucy leaned toward Ethan and signed with great seriousness, "Daddy signed stories at bedtime." Lily added, "Mom says hands can hug from far away." Ethan swallowed. For reasons he could not entirely explain, that sentence affected him more than Vanessa's rejection had. Maybe because cruelty bruises where tenderness heals. Maybe because one stranger had just told him he was too much, while two children were sitting at his table as if his language was the most natural thing in the world. The 5 minutes became 30. Then an hour. Nora repeatedly offered to return the girls to their own table, but Ethan waved it off each time. They ordered fries, then pasta. The twins insisted Ethan help decide whether Buttons would prefer macaroni or mashed potatoes if she were alive. Lily informed him that she could spell hippopotamus, but not restaurant. Lucy asked if business people ever got lonely in tall buildings. Ethan nearly choked on his water at that one. Nora caught his eye and signed, "You don't have to answer that." But Ethan did. "Yes," he signed. "Sometimes." Lucy nodded as if this confirmed a theory. Nora asked him about his company, and unlike most people, she did not make him explain his deafness as prelude to his competence. She asked about product design, user feedback, hiring philosophy, whether accessibility should be integrated from the beginning or retrofitted later. Ethan found himself answering with more enthusiasm than caution. She was sharp. Not performatively informed, but genuinely curious. When she disagreed with one of his thoughts about educational software, she did so with such thoughtful conviction that he laughed again, surprised at how quickly this table had become real. By the time dessert menus arrived, the sting of the earlier rejection had receded into distance. Not gone, exactly. Just rearranged into perspective. When the twins finally began drooping with fatigue, Nora stood to gather their sweaters. "We should go," she signed. "They have school tomorrow, and I've already let them hijack enough of your evening." Ethan stood too, reluctant in a way that startled him. "It was the best part of my evening," he signed. Nora looked at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to believe that. Then she did. Lily reached up and tugged Ethan's sleeve. "Don't be sad tomorrow," she signed. "That lady was silly." Nora covered her face. "Lily." Ethan bent down to Lily's height. "I'll try." Lucy, still holding Buttons, signed, "Maybe next time you can sit with us first." Next time. Such a simple phrase. Yet it landed like light in a dark room. Ethan straightened and looked at Nora. She seemed to understand the question in his face before he fully formed it. Slowly, with the smallest trace of uncertainty, she reached into her purse, took out a pen, and wrote her number on the back of the children's menu. For the record, she signed as she handed it to him, "I do not usually give my number to men my daughters rescue." Ethan smiled. "For the record, I do not usually lose blind dates and win better company." Nora laughed then, soundless to him but vivid in her shoulders and mouth and eyes. That was how it began. Not with chemistry in candlelight or some cinematic first kiss beneath city lights. It began with humiliation, breadsticks, children's honesty, and the strange mercy of being seen by people who had no reason to perform kindness except that kindness was already their native language. Their first real outing happened 2 weeks later, though calling it a date would have been too neat. Nora suggested the Saturday farmers market because the girls loved it and because public daytime settings felt safer when one is a widowed mother and the other is a man she had met beside a failed blind date. Ethan agreed immediately. He arrived early, carrying small bouquets of sunflowers because Lily had once declared yellow the happiest flower color, and Lucy had nodded solemnly in support. The twins shrieked when they saw him. Nora smiled the kind of smile that begins in surprise and finishes in warmth. If his dinner with them had felt improbably easy, the months that followed were not easy at all. They were better than easy. They were true. Truth meant Ethan slowly learning the geography of Nora's life. She was 34. She had married young and happily. Her husband, Daniel, had been born deaf to hearing parents and had fought hard for every inch of dignity in a hearing world. He and Nora had met at a college volunteer event. She'd taken ASL classes to communicate better with participants. He had teased her mercilessly about her first clumsy signs. They had built a life full of ordinary plans, careers, mortgage payments, half-finished home projects, children's lunches, arguments over laundry, dreams about taking the girls to the ocean. Then, when the twins were 3, a truck driver ran a red light and Daniel never came home. Truth also meant Nora learning Ethan beyond headlines. She saw the discipline beneath his success and the exhaustion beneath the discipline. She saw how fiercely he guarded his private wounds. She saw how often he defaulted to competence when he didn't know how to ask for comfort. She saw that he never entered a room without locating exits, lighting, and sight lines. She saw that he could handle billion-dollar negotiations with less visible tension than ordering coffee from a distracted barista who refused to look at his face. The twins, of course, saw none of these things with adult complexity. They simply decided Ethan belonged. To Lily, Ethan was a magnificent source of answers, piggyback rides, and serious facial expressions that were fun to interrupt. To Lucy, he was safe silence, the kind that did not demand noise to prove love. They taught him the rules of sidewalk games. He taught them how to fingerspell their names faster. They decorated his apartment one rainy afternoon with paper stars and informed him that his living room had previously looked like a hotel for sad robots. He kept the stars. Still, love did not glide into place without resistance. Ethan had not spent decades constructing a controlled life just to surrender easily to unpredictability. And children were unpredictability with shoes on. They were also attachment, and attachment meant risk. He told himself he liked Nora. He told himself he loved the girls. He told himself that what they had was enough without naming it. But at night, alone in his apartment, old fears gathered. What if he stepped too far into their lives and failed them? What if the girls came to rely on him and he became another absence? What if Nora eventually realized that caring for a deaf partner while raising children was, in Vanessa's cruel phrase, a lot? What if Daniel's memory always stood between them like a closed door Ethan had no right to open? Then there was the world outside their private tenderness. Ethan's board wanted him hyper-focused as his company prepared for an international product launch. Long hours multiplied. Travel increased. Investors pressed harder. Accessibility, the very principle upon which Ethan had built his business, became marketing language in the mouths of people who cared more about public image than actual inclusion. When Ethan pushed back, he was labeled emotional. When he insisted on deaf leadership at key levels of expansion, one board member remarked in a meeting that perhaps he was too personally attached to the mission to be objective. Ethan had stared at the man for a full 3 seconds before signing to his interpreter, "Tell him my objectivity built his returns." The story spread through the company by lunch. At home, Nora was fighting a different kind of battle. Lucy began struggling in school. Not academically, she was brilliant, but socially. Another child had mocked her for signing with her hands at recess and called it baby talking. Lucy stopped signing in public for nearly 2 weeks. Lily responded by punching the boy in the arm and earning herself a stern parent-teacher conference. Nora, exhausted, guilty, and grieving all over again because Daniel was not there to help guide his daughters through identity and difference, began pulling back emotionally even as she kept functioning outwardly. Ethan noticed. One evening he arrived at Nora's house, a modest blue home with peeling porch paint and marigolds in chipped clay pots, to drop off groceries after a late workday. Through the kitchen window he saw Nora standing at the sink, shoulders shaking. She was crying silently while drying dishes. He froze. Not because he didn't care. Because he cared deeply and was suddenly terrified of choosing the wrong response. By the time she opened the door, she had wiped her face and arranged herself into composure. "Hi," she signed. He held up the grocery bag. "Emergency pasta delivery." She smiled automatically. It vanished when he touched his chest, then pointed gently toward his own eyes and mimed tears. "I saw." Nora looked away. The girls were already asleep. Ethan set the groceries down and waited, not pressing. Finally Nora sank into a kitchen chair and covered her face with both hands. "I'm so tired," she signed when she looked up. "I am so tired of being strong in front of them all the time." Ethan sat across from her. She went on, words spilling now that the dam had cracked. "Lily acts fearless, but she's angry all the time lately. Lucy is shrinking herself. School says they need support. Bills are stacking up. The clinic cut my hours. My car is making a noise I can't afford to investigate. And sometimes I still reach for Daniel in my sleep, and when I wake up I hate myself because 3 years should have made me better at this." Ethan watched every sign, every tremor in her mouth. He wanted to fix everything at once. Money? Easy. School? He knew people. Car? Done tomorrow. But what she was offering him was not a problem list. It was trust. So he answered carefully. "You do not have to be strong with me." That did it. Nora broke fully then, crying with the deep helplessness of someone who had been postponing collapse for months. Ethan moved around the table and knelt beside her chair. He touched her only after she leaned toward him first. Then he wrapped his arms around her and simply held her. No grand speech. No promise to erase pain. Just presence. After a long while Nora pulled back and laughed through tears. "You know what's funny? People think silence is emptiness. But silence with the right person is the first place I've rested in years." Ethan felt that sentence settle inside him like a vow. Their first kiss happened that night in her kitchen, soft and tentative and grief-aware, like both of them understood they were not starting from untouched lives but from ruins where something new might still grow. For a while after that, happiness came in humble forms. Sunday pancakes. Workdays ending at Nora's porch. Lily insisting Ethan judge living room dance performances he could not hear but always applauded. Lucy curling beside him on the couch with picture books, signing the stories with solemn concentration. Nora falling asleep against his shoulder during movies neither of them finished. He began learning what family felt like when it wasn't assigned by blood but built by repeated return. And yet the closer he came, the more the old fear sharpened. The crisis arrived in winter. Ethan's company was negotiating a merger that would put his accessibility platform into schools nationwide. It was the kind of deal he had dreamed about for years, transformational not only for profits but for impact. But the acquiring firm wanted operational streamlining. That was executive language for cuts. Cuts meant layoffs. It also meant pressure on Ethan to relocate temporary operations overseas for 6 months. 6 months. When the board presented it, they framed it as obvious. Strategic. Necessary. Ethan sat at the long conference table beneath recessed lights, hands still, interpreter beside him, and felt the future split. Take the deal, and he could expand his mission beyond anything he had built alone. Refuse it, and investors might force leadership changes anyway. Accept the overseas commitment, and he risked becoming a visitor in the very family he had finally allowed himself to love. That same week, Lucy's teacher requested an urgent meeting. Lucy had stopped participating in class presentations entirely. When asked why, she wrote on a worksheet, "I don't want people to look at our hands and think we are strange." Nora showed Ethan the note that evening. He read it once. Then again. For a man who had spent his life fighting systems, it was astonishing how devastating a child's quiet shame could be. Nora looked defeated. "I teach them to be proud. I tell them their father's language is beautiful. I tell them difference is not something to hide. And still. She did not finish. Ethan thought of his own childhood. Of teachers who praised him as long as he adapted without inconvenience. Of classmates who learned a few signs for fun and then abandoned them. Of adults who applauded his resilience while doing nothing to make the world less hostile. He thought of 7-year-old Ethan, newly deaf, staring at his reflection as if silence had changed his face. Without fully planning to, he made a decision. The next morning, Ethan cleared his calendar for the afternoon and drove to the twins' school. He had never visited during school hours before. He signed in at the office while the receptionist struggled not to over-enunciate at him. He smiled politely and typed on his phone when necessary. The principal, to her credit, had prepared an interpreter, but Ethan mostly managed on his own. He asked permission to speak at the school assembly. The principal looked startled. About your company? Ethan shook his head. About hands, he signed. That afternoon, children filled the multipurpose room in a blur of backpacks and swinging legs. Teachers lined the walls. Nora sat in the back, having arrived breathless from work after Ethan's cryptic text telling her only, "Please come to school at 2:30. Trust me." Lily sat straight as a flagpole. Lucy looked alarmed. Ethan stood on stage with an interpreter beside him but did not begin immediately. Instead, he signed his name first. Then he waited while the interpreter voiced it.